Okay.
Recording is live, FYI.
Thank you, brother.
As soon as the clock strikes 7, I will be emptying the waiting room into the presentation, and Brother Robinson, you'll be good to go.
Okay, thank you. I got it. I'm going to,
Of course, I'll announce when I'm going to do that.
okay, and what I will do is just to share my screen to kick it off.
I'm going to mute. Showtime, brothers.
Brother Robinson, it looks like we are at about 26. Let's give them a few more seconds to join us.
Mm-hmm. You got it.
All right, let's get it started.
All right. This is our Freedom Season graphic. Just some of the things that we're doing to take care of acknowledging folks who are out voting with early voting. We have passed out a lot of these celebratory cards to just encourage folks to get out and vote. We passed them out in underserved areas. And what this card talks about is some of the different activities, as well as on the back, the locations, 11 locations that we have for early voting and where the polling stations are. Okay. Ready for the video, sir?
Yes, sir.
Okay, it's yours.
Good evening, friends, family, colleagues, and my Greek brothers and sorors of Montgomery County. My name is Brother Kevin Johnson, and as president, I bring you greetings from the brothers of the 520th House, the Montgomery County chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, seated in Silver Spring, Maryland. Tonight, I'd like to welcome you to part 3 of our Pass the Mic speaker series dedicated to motivate, inspire, and challenge the members of our community to take action in an unprecedented, I repeat, an unprecedented political environment. Committed focus on political action, our series format is designed to discuss the challenges of the day, identify at a minimum 3 takeaways that we can immediately act upon, and support participants in that action to ensure a positive outcome for this and future election cycles. Part 1 of our speaker series, done in partnership with our sorors of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, educated our audience on how, when, and what residents would be voting on. Part 2 of the series was a visit with our US Senator from Maryland, Chris Van Hollen, for a candid discussion on what's happening on Capitol Hill. Tonight, we bring it even closer to home as we learn the latest on police reform, accountability, and effectively engaging with the community to ensure positive outcomes. And we hear it directly from the top police officer in the county. With the tremendous growth in our population, the ongoing discussions around social justice, inequity, and police brutality, and with events such as the election that has and will continue to generate all kinds of activity in our neighborhoods, this conversation is rather timely. So tonight, we pass the mic to the Montgomery County Chief of Police, Marcus Jones. Just a quick introduction. Chief Jones was appointed the 17th Police Chief of the Montgomery County, Maryland Department of Police in November 2019. He is a 35-year veteran of the department and recently served as the Assistant Chief of the Investigative Services Bureau. He also currently serves on the Maryland Violence Intervention and Prevention Advisory Council. His previous service reflects his stellar experience in the field. Commander of the 3rd District, Director of Major Crimes, Drug Enforcement Commander, board member of the Montgomery County Domestic Violence Coordinating Council, former national chairman of the National Black Police Association, where prior to being elected, he held several leadership positions in the MBPA and its chapters. He served on the board of directors for the National Law Enforcement Memorial Fund and the Task Force on Mentoring in Montgomery County. Chief Jones has a Bachelor of Science degree in Business Administration from the University of Maryland, University College, and is a graduate of the FBI National Academy, session number 267, the National Executive Institute, and the Police Executive Leadership Institute. He is a member of the Major Cities Chiefs Association, the Maryland Chiefs Association, the Police Executive Research Forum, and the International Association Chiefs of Police. Finally, the Chief has helped create an award-winning diversity training program for the police department, which he has taught to numerous, I repeat, numerous academy classes. Without question, he is an expert in this topic of policing, an advocate for our interests, and an exceptional resource for our community. So, ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome for Montgomery County Chief of Police and our Alpha brother, Marcus Jones.
Thank you, Brother Johnson. Thank you to my fellow Alpha brothers and to the Iota Upsilon Lambda chapter. And thank you to all who have joined on this this great evening, and really a round of applause to you all for taking out the time to really invest yourselves and to have this conversation with me and to hear some of my comments in regards to policing reform here in Montgomery County and across the country. It is most definitely a very unique time. I've been the chief now for approximately 1 year. Next week will be the 1-year anniversary. And I'll tell you, it is an honor and a privilege to serve as the chief of police here in Montgomery County, to this fabulous community that I find that in my 35 years of raising my family here, I can tell you it is one of the most unique communities in this country. And I think it serves us well to know how our police department serves our community in so many different facets, and particularly in today's environment, which is challenging for all. I will tell you all that when I first took this job, one of the things that I was more than excited about was the opportunity and the challenges of some reform. We know that there was lots of discussion going on in our community in the selection of a police chief in regards to how our community viewed our police department. Why did they view it that way? It has always been known throughout my career that there are times we've had challenging relationships with, for example, in the African-American community and other minority communities. And then sometimes I make this statement that those communities that need us the most, they trust us the least. And so those things we have to really work hard at developing strong relationships, because I think when you have these types of partnerships, and it's not a one stop shop, it's not that the police department can do everything in its power to maintain the security and safety of our communities. We need the community members who are participants in this just the same. When we're partners in this. And the one thing I really stress to my department and to the officers and employees who work here is to make sure that they understand that we are partners in our mission and that we need community in order for us to be successful. And you can't have that if you don't have strong relationships. So strong relationship building is very important as we move forward. There have been, again, there are lots of changes going on within the department. That usually, you know, when you have change of personnel, you have change in leadership. That's the one challenge in its own right. But now that we've had events that have occurred over the past few months, such as the tragedy of and just atrocious treatment of George Floyd, which in my 35-year career, I've seen nothing like it. It's the most egregious act that I've ever seen a police officer pull off, and just a total disregard for human life. And with that being said, it warranted us to have an opportunity now not to look at it as a problem, but as an opportunity to really come forward with working towards police reform. And that in all of the work that I've done over the past 35 years, to include my advocacy for the National Black Police Association and to work with other organizations and communities in order to bridge gaps between police departments and communities. This is what the work was all about in order for us to try to work towards gaining that trust and to have fair representation for officers within to be able to represent the community and serve the community in which they live. So with that being said, again, with these reforms, what have we done here in Montgomery County? And one of the things I can tell you that I think that serves my heart proud is the fact that we've had discussions with lots of folks from our community, particularly in the minority community, who've never had discussions with policing and what does policing look like in their community with us. And we've had sit-down conversations. We've had, plenty of virtual meetings like we're having tonight. And I think it's given us an opportunity to learn a lot about them, and they've learned a lot about us. And that's some of the information I'll share with how I think it proves that can be a winning combination for us all as we continue to develop relationships with law enforcement in our community, because policing is local. However people look at it, there are 18,000 police departments in the United States of America. And every community is different. Montgomery County is different than, for example, the city of Baltimore. But yet there are things that, that we sometimes confront are the same, and sometimes they're totally different when we look at the type of communities in which we police. And so we have to look at that, and the community has a large say in how policing is done and the way that they want policing done in their community. And I think that's important. And so there are things that are in motion now that the community is getting some say on how that will be. And we'll be moving that forward in the coming months and in the coming years. But with that being said, we still have work to do. There are some challenges. And so I'm going to pause here for now. And we can begin the question and answer period, because I know there's quite a lot of discussion that we want to have, and I want to give everyone plenty of time to be able to answer those questions. So again, thank you, Brother Johnson, and all the brothers for allowing me the opportunity to be here this evening.
Okay, Brother Green, if you will.
All right. The first question is this, Chief. Can you name the 3 specific successful reforms that have already been implemented in the police department thus far?
Yes, sir. So thank you for that, Brother Green. Yeah, so when I first took over, one of the first things that before even the unfortunate death occurred with Mr. Floyd was the fact that I realized that we needed a duty to intervene policy by our department. And I began working on that in the late winter of this year. And as we were moving forward to finish with that policy and to present it out, of course, the tragedy struck. And then there became sort of really a strong need for us to expedite that policy. I was able to successfully to implement that policy in June of this year. So now our department does have a written policy on officers who have to intervene when officers are doing something wrong, violating a policy, such as the excessive use of force as an example. And it's a requirement that they do that. We'll be also training to that particular policy. We'll send out an extensive training plan on that the beginning of next year. There's also been some changes in legislation that has kind of moved us towards some reform that's been put into motion. We have the county council led by Brother Will Jawando initiated a change in our use of force policy. Some changes with that required that we now have a higher standard in the utilization of deadly force. And that force, which is now deemed to be that higher standard, is now necessary versus just objectively reasonable by another police officer. So with that added piece to our policy, we'll be making some additional changes to our policy in the coming month. And then we will be implementing that and training that out as well in the coming month as well. And then the final thing I would note is that the no chokeholds. We had already had a no chokeholds policy that was already within Montgomery County Police. From a reform standpoint, we had eliminated that lateral vascular restraint that we called it back in 2012. But now that the council has added this as a part of the legislation, that is an additional part. So those are 3 successful reforms that have been put into place thus far.
Okay, thank you. Police Chief Jones, we're going to now take a question from the chat, and we will take questions from the chat and then read questions we have. And the question from the chat that we have are, what specific steps should we take to work towards ensuring that a majority of our police officers actually live in the city or jurisdiction that the police live in?
So that's a great question, because that's a very challenging question. As you all know, Montgomery County is a great place to live. It is undoubtedly so. But one thing that we also know is that Montgomery County is a very expensive place to live. And we have brought in, when we bring in new officers or even the officers that exist, there's no requirement that they actually live in the county. Right now, we probably have about 60 to 65% of our police department that actually lives in Montgomery County. But there is a portion of our department that lives outside of Montgomery County. They live in a variety of places, and Prince George's, they live in Baltimore County. Some live in the city of Baltimore, Annapolis area, Frederick County, and even beyond. So those are challenges, it's no doubt. We've always talked about trying to figure out ways to make for more affordable housing. We've always gotten some feedback from some of our younger recruits that come here who make a good starting salary. But I, as even a parent of a young teacher who knows how difficult it is to really go out on your own and be able to afford living here in Montgomery County. So one of the things we look for are some of these options in which we can provide better opportunities for people, because we do want people to live in the county. We want people to be from the county and to invest in the county. That's one of the things we're working with some of our recruiting standpoint now in our younger recruits, particularly our cadets. We have a cadet program that we're actually paying young folks, or people who are interested in the profession. They don't necessarily have to be young, but they can be, and the majority of them are. We actually pay them a half salary. Basically, they earn about $25,000 a year while they're attending college, in order to obtain the minimum college credits to come on the police department. In the meantime, they're gaining some experience in working with the department, but they're only working 20 hours a week while they're actually going to college full time. So this has been very fruitful, because we've been able to really gain some success for those individuals now joining our department who already live here in Montgomery County. So we're hoping to really kind of gain on that to make that an important piece. But we want to make sure our officers are invested for a large degree in our communities, to make sure that we're getting the best out of them.
Thank you.
Chief, can you name what are the next 3 top reform priorities to be implemented?
Okay, so so many of you may have heard or may not have heard, but the county executive, Mark Elridge, has created a couple of things that we're moving forward to make some recommendations in the world of reform. One of the first things he's doing is he's created what they call a reimagining public safety task force. And they're looking at a wide variety of issues within policing, Montgomery County Police, across the board. And with that being said, this committee, this task force, which is approximately about 40 plus individuals, plus some folks who have been appointed to assist with this within the county government. They will be presenting some recommendations in early January on some reform issues that they would like the county executive to move forward with the police department. So we're working with them on those changes as we speak. Also, when I first took over the police department, there was lots of discussion about the inequities in traffic stops, that we were stopping more people of color than we were of white drivers, for example, arresting more people of color in the county than not. So one of the things I pledged to the county executive when I took over was the fact that I thought it would be really interesting, really good for the county for us to have an external audit to allow people from the outside to be able to look into Montgomery County Police and really provide a real baseline for our community, so they can understand and know what exactly is our police department doing. And I think that coming in with this unbiased view will help the community really understand the police department a lot better. So I think that's going to be positive. And if there's, we're expecting some recommendations as a result of that audit. I'm open to that, because I think we should be accountable. We should be transparent. That's one of the things I've looked at, being transparent. So the county executive went without hesitation in response to supporting this. So he has hired an external audit consulting group that will begin its work very shortly. in looking into our police department. So I think that's going to be a successful reform as well. And then finally, there's also the county council and the county executives created legislation to start a police advisory commission. It's a 3-year commission that's currently just began its work back in, I want to say late August to early September. So they're really kind of digging in and trying to get an understanding of the police department, and again, looking at policies and procedures, looking at making recommendations. So those are, again, some things that we're looking at across the board about where that reform is currently.
Thank you very much. From the chat, we see a lot of great questions. The next one we're selecting: it is well documented that racist police officers are members of our police force. What are we doing to identify them? And then what do you do when you find them?
So a great question. So there are lots of things that we implement within the department. One of the things that exists is, of course, is our internal affairs division. So anytime we get complaints, those complaints go directly in that division is directly under me as the chief of police. They work direct. They don't work for anybody else. The captain who leads that division, it reports directly to me. I handle, and every complaint that comes in is documented. And so whether it's a complaint of a serious violation, such as doing work in such a way that it may be considered to be racist in its own form, any harassment or discrimination, that's a violation of our policy, such as racial profiling. Those are the things that we will focus on in order to deal with. Now, of course, all of that requires us to go through the disciplinary process whenever we find someone who has violated any sort of wrongdoing that might be considered to be racial discrimination, whether it be internally and externally. And we deal with that accordingly through the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, the disciplinary process in which we are to deal with. One of the things I also do is we train our supervisors. We have an extensive training at all of our supervisors who are at the rank of sergeant and above, that they also are trained on fair and impartial policing. And one of the things that we're really targeting in that particular training is that we're working with them to identify bias in their employees. So when we know that, again, we can say, for example, in the world of implicit bias, which it has a lot of conversation about that in our society today. And we've been training in implicit bias for the last couple of years, and we found that to be very important. We know that everyone has biases, regardless of the color of your skin, what you look like. But at the end of the day, we have to get down and get to understand those biases so we can make sure that that's not impacting in a negative way, and how we go about actually enforcing the law and policing our community. So that's something that's very important to us. That's something we train in many different facets. One of the ways we train it is that we put this training into our what we call scenario-based training. So scenario-based training is you put these officers in a situation, and I'll give you a case like we'll do it particularly with our recruits, but we do it in a variety of different ways, but I'll give an example. We'll have an interaction with the community member that's one is African-American, is an African-American male. He could probably be a tall and a really big guy versus a small white woman. And just give the officers just the basic information that says that there's a dispute going on and you need to go handle that dispute. And what we'll see is what we're looking for is to watch to see who goes and to the African-American male, who technically is not the way we set it up. That's not the person who's creating the problem, is actually the white woman that's creating the problem. So that way we can teach to, when we find officers who are going down the wrong road, we make them realize that they came in with a bias, thinking that the African-American male was the problem right from the beginning. So those are some of the things that we can do to really kind of get officers to think differently. because that's important. Because again, if you've never kind of been put in these situations before, depending upon the culture you come from, you could you can be treating people unfairly. So that's important for us to focus on that type of training, not only in just with our recruits, but we also do it with in-service training, which we require all of our officers to go to in-service training annually. That's a mandate by the Maryland Police Training Commission and by our police academy.
Chief, how has the proposed Police Accountability Act changed the perceptions of your officers? And if it passes, what impact do you foresee it having on day-to-day operations?
Yeah, so I think what's where our police officers are, right? There is I will share that I think that that many of our officers see a lot of changes coming very rapidly in the profession. They see a lot of critiquing of the job on a daily basis, and that puts some officers on edge. It puts many of our officers on edge because they think that sometimes they feel like they're under the microscope so much. One of the things that I think has been really important for our department that we've seen over the past 5+ years is the fact that we have body-worn cameras. We've been having them implemented them over the past 4 years. All of our patrol officers have them. And I will tell you, it's been a benefit because it allows us, even as the executive staff, to be able to really see what our officers are doing on a daily basis, particularly when it comes to complaints. We take all of our use of force, every use of force that's implemented by any officer, the body-worn camera video is viewed by an executive. And if we see that actual interaction is outside of the realm of our outside of our policy, then we will address that accordingly, moving towards discipline if we so see fit that this violated our policy. But the Police Accountability Act, there's a lot of things in it as relates to some of what I've already discussed that we've already realized that our department has changed to. Our department members understand that change is here and more change is coming. And I think people are willing to be upfront and say they're willing to look at that change and be a part of that change. But I also realize that I think that there's some things in Police Accountability Acts that's been talked about that can have a little bit of reservation. For example, when people talk about qualified immunity, if you go outside of Police Accountability Act and you talk about defunding the police, that creates that's where people have really large reservations about how impactful. One of the things I will stress that I think it's important in this discussion, and I've since stated this with several of our politicians, and I continue to have these discussions. It's important for all of us to be educated on both sides. And what sometimes we find is that there's a rush to make legislation without having those conversations and really understanding where we can come to some really good agreements and good law that I think will be beneficial for us down the road. So what we've really stressed to, I think many of our politicians, is just the ability to slow it down. Let's really work through the issues so that we can come up with some solutions to some changes in police reform that I think it's vital for us to be successful as we move forward. But again, policing, you have to really kind of monitor. I think one of the jobs I have as the chief of police is to keep the morale of my police department at a high level. And that can be a challenge because when police officers feel as if they are being defeated in many other ways and they see things that are going on across the other parts of the country, and that they are sometimes being put into that label, they feel like they no matter what they do, it's not getting noticed. And so one of the jobs that's most endeared to my heart is my job as a leader to make sure that they understand the importance of what they do, the importance to the community, and the community also sharing those thoughts. And that does happen, but sometimes we don't hear it enough. But it's one of those things that we continue to work in order to make sure our officers are really providing the best police service to our community, and something I make sure that we are doing, because that's the mission and that's my expectation.
Okay, from the chat, we are combining a couple questions into one. Basically, given the mistrust and discomfort in the community for minorities and immigrants, especially Black men, what can the police department do to help build that trust back so that the community doesn't feel as victimized for standing with a group of friends and having a good time or just driving?
Right. So it's something I have stated for many years of my career, and this is what we're discussing. Is this is not new. This has been discussed in our community, the African American community, for a very long time. When I was a patrol officer, it was exactly, we would have these same conversations about, and one of the things I realized many years ago in my younger days when I was a patrol officer, that we did not a lot of times explain to folks when we had these interactions with them, and they would be legal interactions, but we did not explain why we did what we did. There were times we were doing things and we just did it because people said, well, we're the police. You just do what we tell you. And that was the end of it. And I realized that that was never the right way for us to go about doing this. We needed to change the way that we interacted with people, as well as explain to them exactly what had just happened. So, for example, I can remember years ago in Silver Spring, for example, there was a call for a carjacking involving for example, an Acura. And there were 3 African-American males described as the suspects in that carjacking. And when we actually saw a vehicle that matched the description in downtown Silver Spring, and we stopped the car, and we got all of the guys out of the car, basically had them on the curb. And in the end, when we brought the victim by, the victim said, no, that's not them. So the officers basically just told the guys, okay, you're free to go. But they never explained to the officer, to the young men, why we did what we did. And I did a timeout. And I'm like, no, we're going to explain to them why we stopped them, right? They did fit the description. That we were spot on about that. It fit the car description. But what it didn't fit, right, was that they were the guys. And so once we explained it to them, they better understood what had just happened. But the reality is you can't do this work, even if you're stopping somebody that's on the corner. There's a reason. You have to articulate why you're stopping them, right? If you're going to go to court and you're doing something, you have to be able to articulate exactly why you did what you did. And what I think we've not done a good job of, and we've really worked on this from a training perspective, is that we are explaining to people more about what we do and why we don't, or why we do it. So if we're not doing that, then we're falling down, right? We're not developing a relationship, a positive relationships in the community at times. Again, same thing like if we stop somebody in a traffic stop. I remember stopping a young man one day for speeding going up New Hampshire Avenue by the White Oak Middle School. And he slowed down for the speed cameras after he had already blown my doors off, and then he wanted to speed back up after the speed cameras. And then he wanted to have an argument, but at the end of the day, it was really kind of like slowing him down to get him to understand why I had pulled him over. So he understood he was speeding. He didn't realize that, but at the end of the day, it needed to be a more positive interaction. And so what I wanted to share with him was, if he created a negative interaction with another police officer, it might not have been the same outcome, because at the end of the day, all I wanted to do was give him a warning because I was hungry and I wanted to go home and eat dinner, right? Sometimes that's just the way it is, right? But we got to make sure that our officers really outline to our folks that, and again, this is something from our perspective, we have to really work hard in the training world. We have to do this, really work hard to oversee this from our supervisors to make sure that we're doing this. in order to help develop these positive relationships. And I can tell you there's a lot of positive relationships being built, but we have a very large community and we have a very small police department compared to the large, how large our community is. So with that being said, we have to figure out ways to best communicate, but to be positive and to have these positive interactions and to have more positive outreach and develop these relationships. As I go back to that, when you develop positive relationships, you can have those courageous conversations about those interactions. When you don't have those positive interactions, you don't have a positive relationship, then we're going to have problems. And that's where we're really trying to make some positive changes there.
Chief, can you speak to your police officer's duty to intervene or report misconduct of other officers when they don't abide by your policy?
So yes, so as I noted earlier, right, we do have this duty to intervene, and it requires our officers to, in the midst of officers doing wrong duty, for example, if they were actually, doing a chokehold on an individual, knowing that that's a violation of our policy, that officer who would see that in motion would have a duty to step in and make sure that officer didn't do that, and even take over for that officer in order to take them out of that situation. So one of the things that's always a concern that people always talk about is, well, excuse me, what do you think is, the retribution of another officer who would then report out on his fellow officer? So we have those stopgaps in place in our policy that make sure that there's no whistleblower retribution against an officer who does actually complain about an officer's wrongdoing. We've had officers report out on other officers. Of course, it doesn't get highlighted in our media, but it does happen from time to time about violations of the policy, that they might think that the officer did something wrong from a use of force standpoint. They think an officer did something wrong in some other violation of policy of making a poor arrest or doing something that is outside of the guidelines. That's what we want. That's exactly where we want to be. But the point being is that we have to change a culture. And a culture has been historically where many people felt as if they didn't feel like, if they weren't necessarily involved with it, that they shouldn't have anything to say. Well, that means that we have to change this culture. And that's part of what I am doing. So part of that is, it's about how we now put this into our training. And we're going to train specifically on this next year, beginning next year, and it'll be pushed out for years to come, that we're going to help our officers understand the duty to intervene and how they have to report on officers in order to make it for a safer place for them and as well as the community. And so there's some extensive training that I know New Orleans Police Department has been integrally involved in. We're working with the originators of that training that introduced it to New Orleans. I will be implementing that sometime in the coming year or so. But we're going to, again, as we've created this policy, we have to make sure that our officers are held accountable. And so with that being said, we have to have the duty to intervene in order for them to be able to step in when officers are doing something of wrongdoing. This also goes to a lot about de-escalation. I'm sure there's other questions about de-escalation, but de-escalation means that, again, sometimes, look, we're the one thing I always say about police officers, we're from the human race, right? All of my officers have bad days. Sometimes the dog doesn't want to go out when you want to go out in the rain, or the wife or the husband, there's an argument and you just come to work and it's not a good day. We all been there. But at the end of the day, if that officer's having a bad day, it's important for another officer to come in and step in and take that officer out of that situation. That's a part of the de-escalation techniques that we're also utilizing to make sure that we're taking care of each other when the situation is not being productive, when there's an escalation of attitudes and sometimes just, people want to take it to a different level. That's not what we want. We want to be able to de-escalate any situation that we have in order for us not to create the moment, to stay out of those moments that always seem to take it to a level that might warrant the end to be a bad result. So that's important for us to be involved in.
Okay, following up and from the chat, do you support repeal of the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, which gives special protection to police officers when under investigation for misconduct?
So I have been on record to note that the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, of course, is a very unique piece of legislation. Of course, we have in Montgomery County, in the state of Maryland, we have unions, collective bargaining agreements with our unions. Of course, Maryland being a union-friendly state, that is something that we have had in Montgomery County for quite some time. And I am not a proponent of eliminating the entire Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, but I do think there are some significant changes that could be made that would make it more effective. And it would take away some of the protections that some people feel as if their law enforcement officers are somewhat, if you want to make the argument that the union will help to protect them in some ways. And the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights primarily goes to disciplinary functions of the police department. And so real quick, I'll try to explain this. So for example, in Montgomery County, we have the Fraternal Order of Police is the union for our police officers, the rank of sergeant and below. So anybody that's in that rank are automatically members of the FOP. That's a collective bargaining agreement union. What is unique about it is the fact that if I have an officer that's violated a certain policy, a serious policy, so it's, for example, excessive use of force, untruthful statements, something that's very serious, and I want to say, for example, I want to fire that officer. I want to terminate that officer. That officer has a right, regardless of what the penalty is from a violation that's being investigated by internal affairs. That's a serious violation. They do have certain rights in order to have an administrative hearing in order to address the charges that they are facing. So if this officer but there's two options. Under the traditional Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, there is a part that says there is what they call a traditional hearing board. That hearing board has 3 people, a 3-person panel, could be more. It depends on the community, how you set it up. You could have community members attached to that board if you so choose. But at the end of the day, you have what we have an executive officer that will be appointed by the chief of police, along with an officer who is of equal rank and another officer appointed by the chief. That is the basics. You have to have at least a minimum of a 3-person panel to deal with that. Where it gets complicated, and I think where a lot of discussion has been in the state, and particularly here in Montgomery County, has been what we call the alternative hearing board. And the alternative hearing board is actually led by a neutral arbitrator. So the neutral arbitrator is the individual that leads that board. The chief of police select one executive to sit on the panel, and the Fraternal Order of Police selects another person. The unique part about this is that if I make the recommendation, which is prior to the hearing board being held, that I want to terminate that officer, the neutral arbitrator and that panel could override my decision. And that's the problem that I have with this particular part of the legislation. And that's one of the things I would like to see eliminated. So I know the Maryland State Legislature is actually looking into this. They've actually made the recommendation. There's those that want to totally eliminate the LEOBR. We will see how that goes. There'll be lots of discussion, I'm sure. But if they do eliminate it, if it's totally eliminated, there will still have to be a disciplinary process put into law, because still there's going to have to be these processes that each police department is going to have to create some sort of hearing system, pretty much like the federal government and other state governments, in order to deal with these types of allegations.
Chief, in regards to police training, communities of color, and what measures, if any, does this training encompass and currently provided to your officers to ensure a positive outcome? In other words, what training is absolutely necessary?
So always a great question on training and how it relates to our minority community. One of the things, as it was noted in my bio when we began, was my work in the world of cultural diversity here in Montgomery County. And we created this program back in 2006. And we trained the entire police department, both sworn officers and our professional staff. And we've continued to do that with our recruits even up to today. And because Montgomery County is so diverse in so many ways, and when we look at diversity, we talk about communities of color, but we also talk about our diversity in religion. We talk about our diversity in generational differences. We talk about a lot of different parts of the diversity factor, sexual orientation, all of those things that I think it's vitally important, because we have such a unique community here. And this is the thing that we really, because to me, we look at it from making our officers aware. Again, I try to stress to them, I don't necessarily need you to understand all of where people of color have come from, their background, because we have a wide variety. Even people who are in the African-American community, people come from different backgrounds. We come from the South, we come from the West, we come from the North, and we're not monolithic. So we have to people have to understand that. And so, but at the end of the day, you still have to understand some dynamics of our culture and what we've been through. And so one of the things we always talk about is, if you don't know history, then you're bound to repeat the problems that have occurred in the past, particularly when we look at policing used as the oppressor in many governments across this country over the years in our history. And that's something that we vitally impress upon our officers. So one of the things that we really started to embed when the National Museum of African American History and Culture was completed, is that we began to take all of our recruit classes to the museum and to actually experience the African American Museum, so that they would start to see, and they would see some of that history really laid out to them. So it gave them a better understanding of who they're going to be dealing with on a daily basis in their jobs. We took the entire executive staff. And unfortunately, because of COVID, we've had to put that on pause, but that's something that we're going to rejuvenate once we get out of this pandemic, because this is something that I think it's vitally important. We have for years gone to museums such as the Holocaust Museum to experience and go through a police training piece with that. But we've also needed to understand that we need to do this more extensively for our community. And particularly when we talk about all the problems that have resided in the African-American community and other communities such as the Latino community, and dealing with immigration issues, that we really need to understand the dynamics of that and how we can have a negative impact, even though we may not realize this. And I always talk about this power that we have as police officers, that you can have a positive power, you can have positive impact in your community, but you can also be negative as well. And so we need to make sure that we are eliminating that negativity based upon years of history that we've learned that don't work. And I think that's something that's vitally important for us to maintain. And we'll continue with those diversity programs and working with other communities in order to make sure people are well versed and understand these are the things that impact the work that they do, and to be knowledgeable about some of those cultures so that they understand those things that they might have to deal with when addressing or working in those environments.
And the final question from the chat, it seems that the school resource officers are positive and effective. What is your position on making sure they're maintained at our schools?
So I am a strong supporter of our school resource officers. I will tell you, I realize that there's lots of discussion about taking school resource officers out of our schools. We have approximately 166,000 students in our Montgomery County Public Schools. It might be a little bit less from what I'm hearing this year, but still 160,000 plus students is a tremendous and large school system. It's a great school system. We have great relationships with our principals. We have 26 high schools in the county, and the majority of those high schools do have a school resource officer assigned to those schools. There's a lot of discussion about how do we, when we look at the SRO program, what are some of the things that we can do when it comes to where we see the impact of people of color, for example, African Americans, who are sometimes get in trouble. We have a memorandum of an understanding with Montgomery County Public Schools, and we have had this for quite some time. We revised it in 2017, and there are strict requirements about what we can arrest for out of the schools. The school resource officers that I have that work at each school, they do not go to school each day in order to look to arrest students. That is not what the purpose of that program is about. But there are some mandatory requirements about arrest, and I'll talk about those. For example, come to school with a weapon, a gun or knife. Unfortunately, that happens in our school system, and it happens way too much. Serious crimes such as aggravated assaults, and these are assaults that are just not simply fist fights. This is when individuals are really seriously injured as a result of the interaction. So we have victim crimes, robbery, again, very serious in its nature, and the most serious drug violations, not simple marijuana possession, but these serious violations. One of the things we've been working with recently is really having again, when we talk about educating and really doing a deeper dive, this is one of those topics. We have to do a deeper dive, and we've done that with Montgomery County Public Schools because the Board of Education tasked Dr. Smith and the board and his staff to actually sit down with not only the police department and other police departments who are part of the SRO program, but also our juvenile justice system. Those partners that also work with some of our diversion programs. And so we look at this, how can we better serve the students in order not to interrupt our schools and it not always be a police matter to actually intervene in some of these cases. In some cases, I will agree that I think we've come to some conclusions that say there's some matters that maybe we don't necessarily have to be involved in. The one thing we as police do not get involved in, we do not get involved into any discipline programs. And that's one thing we stay far away from because Montgomery County Public Schools, that's their school system. We are there as, quote, a visitor in order to maintain school safety. One of the things in the Maryland Safe to Learn Act, it requires that police departments across the state of Maryland provide adequate coverage at all of our schools in the county. And that's a major task. And that's one of the reasons why I've been a big supporter of SROs, because that is something in order, we look at schools. There are 3 schools right now, and I can think off the top of my head. Blair, Seneca Valley, the new Seneca Valley up in Germantown, and Gaithersburg have over 3,000 students that go to their schools each day. And again, here we are in the world of COVID. But if you think about it, 3,000 students in school, that's a mini city. And I've got 1 police officer that works in those schools and working with the school security staff in order to keep safe schools at that time. One other thing that I think a lot of people don't want to talk about is the fact of our gang activity that we've had over the past several years here in Montgomery County. That to me still is a problem. It hasn't gone away, folks. And one of the main recruiting grounds is our public schools. And our SROs have done a tremendous job and able to help to eradicate, and in some cases where they can, but to at least minimize the amount of activity of any gangs that are out there recruiting, not only at our high schools, but even at our middle schools. And that's something that still concerns me. And I think that by having school resource officers to help our gang unit, to provide them with the intelligence, we had an incredible amount of threats in last year's school year, where we had numerous students who were calling in bomb threats and threatening to shoot up the school. And we had many people, many parents in the community who were upset, who were even afraid to send their kids to school until we were able to figure out what was going on. Who played an integral part in our investigations? The school resource officers. Why? Because they knew the students, they knew the staff, they knew how to get the information out to those individuals in order for us to be able to even go at times to go interview parents, interview those individuals who have made those specific threats in order to make sure that there was no legitimate threat and that the schools are safe the next day. That's important. That's part of my job, is to make sure our students in Montgomery County are safe each and every day. And that's something I pledge to make sure that that continues. And we'll do it whichever way it is decided upon what the SRO program will look like, if it does exist. But I will promise you, I will maintain safety for our schools because that's what I pledged as far as keeping our community safe as well.
Brothers, let me interject here. I know we're at the top of the hour, and I see a lot of tremendous questions coming through as well. So I want to check on the chief, make sure we respect his time. And
It's been a long day, but it's all good. I sacrifice for my brothers of Alpha. It's all good.
I love it. I love it. So why don't we do this? I think we have maybe 4 or 5 more questions. I do, Brother Jones, want to make sure we have some time to sort of have you recap and let us know, not just as brothers, but as the neighborhood. Let us know what we can do to support you. I think
Okay.
that's important.
Much appreciated.
And then we'll go forward from there. So brothers, let's look at maybe 4 or 5 more questions, and then we'll transition.
This question relates to policing policy. What are the areas should be removed from police jurisdiction to eliminate an overworked or an overtasked police force? I'm quite sure you've heard us talk about defund the police. Maybe that is something that falls in this area.
So thank you, Brother Green. Yeah, absolutely. So I have one thing that I've recognized, particularly in the past, really 5 to 6 years, was a tremendous increase in our police department handling individuals who suffer from mental health crisis. And it's something that I think that there's been a great deal of conversation about in our community as well as across the country. And it has really created this direction that we in policing had, because we were really kind of pushed to dealing with individuals, whether they're homeless or whether individuals who are really just people who are who have been dealing with mental health crisis in their lives for quite some time and not getting the treatment. Of course, as many people on this call may know, many years ago, the federal government really, and when we talk about defunding, they really defunded funding for mental health facilities all across this country. And there were mental health facilities that were just releasing people back out into our communities And then now we, the police, became the last option in order to deal with that. So what do we have to create? We had to create crisis intervention teams. We had to do a lot more focus on mental health first aid. All of our police officers here in Montgomery County go through a mental health first aid course. They also go, if they carry a taser, they all have to go through our crisis intervention training. We've expanded our crisis intervention training where we're pushing towards all of our officers actually going through that. But when really that question means to me, it says that there are times when we get called to handle some mental health situations that are not, the person is not a danger to himself or others or herself. They are not causing any harm in the community, nor are they are any threat with any weapon or all, but they do need some sort of, they need attention. They need attention from the mental health professionals. So there has been a commitment to kind of refocus police involvement in that. And here in Montgomery County, which again has always done some really groundbreaking things, and we have a really good health and human services department here in the county that has some focus on what we call mobile crisis teams. But the problem lies is that it's a very small outfit. I have, for example, they have just a few counselors that, again, that might be in the center of Rockville on most days, and they respond and they deal with mobile crisis situations, but it's just a small number of them. And if we have 2 or 3 events going on at one time, then there's no availability for that for success. So there has been an investment by our politicians to put more funding into that. But I would like to see, again, a more robust opportunity for allowed to prevent my officers from having to go deal with these situations where it doesn't impact public safety in any regard. Now, with that being said, I want people to understand that we're not going to be totally out of the mental health response business. Why? Because unfortunately, there are times when individuals get in these crises that weapons do get in their hands, or they have caused injury and sometimes death to other individuals. Therefore, that means we're still going to have to respond and deal with those situations. Our job, the way I look at it, is that we try to figure out ways to do it where again, the main focus is for us is not taking a life, but it's preserving life, to do anything we can to make sure we put ourselves in a predicament that we don't, again, create the moment. We don't always have success at that, but we have to try to figure out ways to the best of our ability. And we're trying to do that with additional training. And it always comes back to training. So Brother Green, as you were saying about defunding the police, this is, well, I'll make this clear. Out of our department, we have our budget is approximately $281 million, for example, in this budget year. We usually have risen up to about 288, but $280 million. 83% of that budget goes to personnel costs, benefits. This other 17% of that goes to operating costs for the police department. But the one thing I will tell you, when we talk about cutting, the only thing you're going to really cut is either you're going to start cutting off, you're going to cut the amount of officers that you have, which means you're going to start, not hiring officers and maintaining the numbers you have. Currently, we have close to 1,300 officers for 1.1 million people in Montgomery County. That's the lowest ratio when we compare ourselves to a jurisdiction such as Fairfax County. They have 1,700 officers. You compare yourself to Prince George's County, they have 1,600 plus officers. They have a lower population than we have. But most importantly, what I see is that then you also impact training. And when you don't train your officers to provide them with the best training all across the field, I think you lose a great deal of professionalism, and you lose a lot of expertise. And I think the better trained police departments that we have, the better it is for our communities. And that's the one thing I don't want to see when people quote say defund. I don't know what that definition really means. Sometimes we want to talk about reallocating. Well, then that's a different conversation. But again, understand that if you're taking away, that means there's probably some other service that's going to be impacted as a result thereof.
If I might follow on, just one question. What about the so-called militarization of the police? What's going on here in Montgomery County in that area? Does this include your budget?
So it is not. So each year in the budget, we specify exactly what we are purchasing, what we need to purchase. So for example, I would tell you last year, one of the largest expenditures for that we put in for this year's budget was the replacement of our bulletproof vests. Now that's what I wouldn't call militarization. That is a necessary a tool for my officers to have to feel safe in doing the job that they do every day, particularly in the world of the violence that sometimes put towards our officers. So we, again, when we look at militarization of the police, that's not our primary focus, right? That's not where I'm out here looking to buy tons of rifles and tons of types of equipment that makes us a military type operation. Again, there are times, for example, for my SWAT team, and I'll give an example. If many of you remember a few years back where we had the individual who went into the Discovery building in downtown Silver Spring and held hostages, and he had a bomb, and that was real. That wasn't fake. That was real. It had every intention to create really turmoil, which he did create. But I will tell you, we were able to rescue many of those folks who were held as hostages because we had the type of equipment that we could put them in an armor type vehicle and get those individuals to safety. Otherwise, you know, we're basically taking a risk. So there is a need, but what's important is that you are not overbuying these types of products. I will tell you that's not going to happen under my watch. I don't think it happened under the previous chief's watch as well. But the one thing is that, again, we're not focusing. When we did protests here in Montgomery County, for example, for the Black Lives Matter movement, there were over 125 protests that happened in the county. Not one day did you see an armored vehicle presented by my department out in the community. All of our protests were peaceful. And in fact, you rarely saw anybody in any type of riot gear at all, for the most part, for those types of events. That's the type of thing that I think from a leadership perspective that's very important, that you utilize these resources when they are needed. They're not always needed every day, and it's not to show this tremendous show of force just because you can do it. And that's not the way I will lead this department. We will make sure we're utilizing them when it is absolutely necessary for the safety of our community.
A question from the chat. Simple question, but given the context, appropriate. How are recruits trained to handle an attack by a knife-wielding suspect? And before you answer that, it's against the backdrop of a African-American wielding a knife who was shot multiple times, obviously not training. You know, if this was in your jurisdiction, what would be happening? What should be happening? And start with, how are they trained initially?
Right. So they are, again, when we talk about de-escalation, this is exactly the type of a situation where you do everything in your power. We train them to utilize these de-escalation techniques in order to be able to best handle an individual with a knife, which is a very dangerous situation. But I will tell you, there are many times we've been able to safely be able to get knives away from these individuals who are threatening harm to others. There's video of an individual in Germantown who was upset with a 7-Eleven clerk, an African-American male, and had a knife basically threatening that clerk. But our officers were, and that was an example of the type, the techniques that they use is exactly the training that we teach them, being able to have somebody try to talk that individual down, and to be able to come up with a plan to successfully try to get that individual unarmed to the best of our ability without utilizing deadly force. So there are these tools, right? The taser, when I talk about the taser, we have many of our officers, not all of them, but we have many of our officers who utilize the taser as an option. But there's other options, again, talking, trying to get people to calm down, to get them out of these situations that they are attempting to try to harm others. So, but you really have to focus on the training and the repetition. And that's one of the things that we find is a bigger challenge, is to make sure our officers are getting these types of repetitions over and over again, and that they're understanding where can they, to make sure that they create time and distance in order to help for other officers to come and help them. When you have other officers that are there, it gives you more options. When you're there by yourself, or just maybe even with one other officer, you have to be very careful about how you address that. So we train these putting yourself in a position of cover, so that if the individual does come at you, that you have maybe some escape route. But again, each officer is different. There's no one magic pill that we all, or one sort of way that we all do it. We have to understand that if I'm an officer that's 6'5", 300, this individual with a knife or a threat I might look different at versus a female officer who's 5'2" and only weighs 125 pounds. And so what is the threat to them, right, at that particular time? Those are the things that, again, the officer has to articulate. But again, we want to put that officer in the best case of survival, as well as making sure others don't get harmed, and also making sure that that individual, hopefully we could take them into custody. And I'll tell you, we do have cases of success. It's just that they don't always get put out in the media, because that's not always the story that the media is looking for.
And then in the case of the current situation where the officers ended up firing multiple times at a person with a knife?
Yeah.
How's that specific case or occurrence viewed or
So,
treated?
yeah. So what I would speak to is just to try to, so folks understand the firing of the weapon when an officer decides to use, at that point, when an officer fires a weapon, they have decided to utilize deadly force. That is not a shoot to wound type situation. We do not train officers to shoot the wound. When you've decided to pull that trigger, you have decided to use deadly force. That's what it's classified as. And you have to articulate why you utilize deadly force. If you felt that that individual with the knife was going to harm you, that articulation must be clear, and it must be objectively reasonable. That's what the Supreme Court has ruled for under the standard in the criminal charges. With that being said, it still requires you to understand that when you fire your weapon, your job is to stop the threat. It is not to shoot as many times as possible in order before the individual goes down. It's simply to drop the threat. To stop the threat. So when the threat stops, all shooting should cease. And that goes to your policy. That's how we train. That should be the way that all departments train across this country. Again, was there another alternative? Was there another option that you could have utilized? I don't know, right? For example, if we're talking about Philadelphia, I'm not sure what Philadelphia has, right? I did hear, and I do know their police commissioner very well. And I know Danielle, I heard her speak yesterday. One of the things she talked about was the lack of infrastructure, a lack of support financially for tasers for their department. Again, when you don't invest, these are sometimes the outcomes in which you have.
Thank you.
Brothers, I know it's about 8:20. I think we should probably wrap up, but I do think it's important that we talk about the election next week. Chief, if you can speak to the prep for the election before and after, we'd certainly appreciate that. And then maybe you can sort of segue into your wrap and what you would like for us to do to support you.
So thanks, Brother Johnson. So I will tell you, I have been working very diligently with my staff over the past several weeks, preparing for the upcoming election. In fact, as you all know, and you have advertised, and I applaud the brothers for really pushing to get out to vote. But as we all understand, here in Montgomery County, early voting has begun. So we have really been monitoring what is occurring across the county to make sure that people feel safe. They are not intimidated or harassed when they vote. And we want that to go all the way through next week, through Election Day. And so this is a discussion not only have I had with local police chiefs here in the state of Maryland and around the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, because all things are local, but we know all of us could be impacted by this election. And we have to be really prepared for anything. And that's what we're doing. We're preparing ourselves. I will have upstaffing next week to make sure that our community is safe. We are not going to election sites. I'm not putting officers at polling sites because I don't want us to look like we're this intimidating force to intimidate people who want to come and express their right to vote. That's not going to happen. But what we are doing is working with all of the election judges at each of these sites with the Board of Elections to make sure that they understand that they can contact us if there are any threats or intimidation or both at any of these sites by any individual that they can't handle. We will be responding to address that accordingly. And what I will say, again, with all of the rhetoric and all of what we know has been going on across the country, there are some grave concerns I have about the mentality of individuals who may be upset come next week, depending upon the results of this election. And so with that being said, we are going to be prepared to deal with any uprising, protest, or anything of that nature, unrest as a result of that. But again, we want to make sure our communities are kept safe. We want to make sure people have exercised their First Amendment right, but we also need to understand that people need to be safe in our community, and that's something we're going to make sure of. But most importantly, we want to protect people's right to vote. And again, we, the police, are not going to get engaged in being in the middle of preventing people from voting and getting to the polls. But we're going to make sure that they're safe if they're there and they can get in and out easily if traffic is an issue. But there's lots for us to do. We're revved up and ready to go and already in motion, and there'll be more happening next week. But we're more than happy to serve our community and make sure people are safe. And so I guess, Brother Johnson, unless there's something else?
Yes, Chief. Anything that, I guess the question is, how can the Brotherhood help you? How can the community help you with what you're trying to do? Not just but long term.
Yeah, I would hope that all of you in our community become well invested in our public safety of our community. I think that what's vitally important, and I would love to see all of you engaged in more discussions about law enforcement and engagement of our young people, particularly where we have some issues of individuals being involved. And I will tell you, one of the most disheartening things I find as a chief of police, and even during my 35-year career, is to watch young people sometimes get themselves in trouble when they really don't have to. And they make a decision to go down this wrong path. And sometimes, when we're trying to redirect them, they're really not listening. And I think it takes a village. I think it takes more than, the police department. I think it takes more than the criminal justice system. I think it takes a larger community for us to get engaged, when we're dealing with our education, system. I think education is the beginning, right? The younger, and we've all been there. I can remember being raised in the southern part of Virginia, and understanding that my grandmother and grandfather didn't take no stuff when it came to going to school and getting your work done, right? And you knew what the rules were, right? And there were repercussions as a result thereof. But we really never wanted to get to the point that a law enforcement officer had to get involved in anything that you did. And this is the message, right, that we've got to continuously put out and work. And I think that part of this, again, too, is working together as partners. And I would suggest that even if wherever you live in your community, knowing your local police commander of the district in which you live is important, because if you have issues in your community that you think needs to be addressed, that commander needs to be made aware of that. That was the one thing I knew of when I worked there. I was a commander of the Silver Spring district, and that I knew that I needed people, I couldn't see everything, right? And that that things that were brought to my attention that needed to be dealt with, it was my job to deal with them and to work with the police administration to handle anything that was wrong in our community or a different approach in order to be more successful. But at the end, we all want to be safe. We all want to be able to go to our communities safe. We want to travel our roadways safely as well. You all can help us tremendously, I think, just by being great partners. This not being the last conversation, and that we continue to have a partnership for a very long time, not only with just me, with all of, with a large part of my staff, understanding how we function and what our responsibilities are for this community.
Thank you so much, Chief. And we really appreciate your time. We know you're a busy man. It is fantastic to see you as the Chief of Police, of course. And it is fantastic to see what you're doing in the community. We certainly
Thank you all so much. Thank you so much.
really appreciate your service. And again, tonight, appreciate your time. A couple of things for the audience. We do have a few more questions in the chat, so please be advised that we are going to post the Chief's email so that you can send the questions to the Chief directly. And in addition to that, we actually have a survey that we will send out to the audience to give us some feedback on the event and the Chief's presentation. Fantastic presentation, fantastic. Brother Campbell, can you wrap us up and then we'll take it home?
Yes, and just in terms of do outs, I think for our chapter that we kind of gleaned from the communications. Number one, there's a young police programs I think we should probably support and help Chief Jones recruit for to help build that relationship in the community. He's also talked about an external audit committee and advisory participation, also something I think the chapter should participate in, make sure we participate. And then finally, host topics in law enforcement. And like he said, let this not be the last time we get together with our community and law enforcement here in Montgomery County. So those are the three quick do-outs that we can look for the chapter to consider going forward.
Fantastic, Brother Campbell. Thank you so much. Brother Robinson, if you could share share the graphics for the next event tomorrow night. I think it's important to let our audience know that we are rolling on tomorrow with our event that speaks to colorectal cancer. I have a Brother Michael Smith, on this panel. This should be an excellent program, and we invite you to do that as well. Appreciate that, Brother Robinson. And you can take us back there. Thank you for your attendance and your participating. To the audience, we really appreciate your time tonight. I know that we've done a lot of Zooms over the last few months, so we certainly appreciate you spending your time with us. And we appreciate the Chief for providing this informative and enlightening event. To our amazing political action team, thank you again for doing what you do, our communications team for making sure this program runs smoothly, and of course, our brotherhood for emphasizing that these types of discussions are necessary to change the conversation, not just in the community, but across the nation. Thank you very much, Brother Jones, Chief Jones. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again and good night.